What's going on, everybody? And welcome into the 69th episode of the CRZY podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates, and this is the show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and everything else that helps to empower creative people. Now, if you want to listen to all the shows, make sure you get the show notes and everything else that goes along with this podcast. Be sure to head over to the CRZY and the number one, thecrazy1.com. New URL, same content. But if you want to find out about the show, listen to other shows, check out the show notes, anything like that, be sure to head over there. And while you're on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you get the new shows whenever they come out. Now, sorry, normally I probably would have stopped this and would have gone back and re-recorded it, as my two pugs have entered the room. I think they definitely want co-producer credits on this show. I do know some people have mentioned that you can hear them in the background for whatever reason. I try to get them out of my studio, close the door whenever I record. They seem to take that as a challenge and often want to come busting in like it's some sort of episode of Cops and they're serving a warrant or something. I don't know. But if you ever hear them in the background, that's what they are, is they seem to like to camp out under my desk and figure out why, even in the cold fall weather, they can find ways of being hot and noisy. Anyway, moving on with the show. This week, I want to talk about a kind of an interesting secret that we all share. And I don't care what level you are in your career. I don't care where you're at. It's something called design imposter syndrome. And it's something, if we're all being honest, that from time to time, maybe we feel like we don't measure up. Maybe we feel like we're a fraud. It comes in a lot of different forms. And this is another one of those problems that I think, I think we don't talk about it enough. I recently read a study that suggested that over 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their career. That's nuts. So in this episode, what I want to talk about is, for creatives in particular, what is it? What are the different flavors of it? How do you fight it? How do you keep it from getting in the way of your creative process and ultimately keep it from holding you back? But let's start with the simple question. What the hell is it? Now, for a lot of these shows, I do a bunch of research. I have my own thoughts and I have my own opinions, but I always want to go out and sort of make sure about how do I ground that in what other people are doing, or how do I be able to go out and research to really make sure that I understand what it is I'm talking about, and especially whenever I get into areas of psychology like this, because again, I think I can empathetically understand it, but whenever you go out and research it, you see that it's a psychological phenomenon where you believe that you are somehow inadequate, often despite of a lot of evidence to the contrary. Now, in real life, it can be where you're having one of those days where you look at your work and you think, man, I just don't think this is very good. I hope other people like it. What if the client hates it? In its simplest form, it's some level of doubt. Maybe you think that when something doesn't work out exactly the way you expect on a project, somehow you failed. Maybe it's some technique you can't grasp, or some work a client didn't like. But at the end of it, on the extreme, maybe you feel like a fake. Maybe you feel like you hope nobody finds out how you work because you think, that's not the way, quote unquote, real designers work. Now, whenever we talk about this, there is a fine line and an intersection point between what is healthy behavior, what is work ethic, what is drive, what are those things that we do need to progress in our career. But it's ultimately about the balance of those things, the size of those things, the scale. Is it a voice that is proportionate, that drives you forward, that you find to be motivating and keeps you moving? Or is it a little bit too big? Is the voice a little too loud? Does it lead to too much self-doubt? Does it lead to destructive behaviors that maybe actually can hold you back and can hurt you? And so as we go through and talk about this, I think that's the thing that I want you to think about, is that in some cases, you may think to yourself, you know what, that's actually something I feel like I need. And in many cases, you'll be completely right. But what it is it's about balance, amount, about how do you start to look at yourself and understand what is it that's going on? How do I accept it? And then ultimately, what do I do about it if that it is out of balance so that I can get it back in the right proportion and it can be a much healthier thing? So why is this something that we all have? Because I did say we all have it, and we do. This is something I struggle with, lots of people I talk to struggle with. I'm sure it's something you struggle with. How much you want to admit it or not, well, that's another story. But we have it because, as I've talked about numerous times before, creating is a personal act. And it's something where whenever you make your mark on a blank page, on a blank screen, on anything else, what informs that mark? What makes you make it the way that you do comes from what you've experienced. What are your things that give you confidence? What are your insecurities? What are everything else in between? What are the ways that you see the world and you connect the dots? So the thing is then that inner dialogue, that personal connection to your work, obviously then is going to create some amount of anxiety whenever it's judged, commented, liked, or disliked. That is a natural part of the process. Now, imposter syndrome is a little bit different because, again, it's how healthy or restrictive is that dialogue. And I think if you don't follow Pablo Stanley on Twitter, I would highly just tell you to go do that. He's somebody I work with at Envision, an amazing designer. He hosts a live show on YouTube, but ultimately he's also a cartoonist. And he does these amazing cartoons about kind of like the day in the life of a designer. And he did one this past week and posted it that really probably pushed me to finish the show because it was just simply somebody asking a designer how they were doing. They replied fine. But then behind them, and you can see in their thoughts, are the 200 other responses about the things they're struggling with, the things that are going well, the things that they aren't, and all this like massive inner dialogue. And that's the part of this, right? Is that this is yet another one of those things that we rarely ever discuss, these insecurities. So this inner loop, this inner dialogue can build up to the point where it can become unhealthy. Because doubt and problems are a part of the process. But here again, it's about the amount and the balance of those that makes the difference. And you may know if you do this, if you do things, because it can sort of come to life in a lot of different ways. If you're constantly going back and changing something in your design, not because you know you can improve it, but because you feel like you don't know what the best choices are. And your design ends up being a mess because you ultimately don't trust yourself. You won't commit to something. So you just sort of try to please everybody. And this is also made more complicated because this industry does have real imposters. Some of these imposters, you know what, they've watched enough YouTube videos, they talk a good enough talk, they fake the funk enough that they look to everybody else like they really know what they're doing. But when the rubber meets the road, you know what, maybe they can't deliver on that. But for so many of us, we never see those moments. We never see where the rubber meets the road. And so what do we end up doing? We end up judging our insides by everybody else's outsides. And there are other ways that imposters can create this false image. And a lot of it is thanks to social media. I say this all the time. Just because somebody looks a certain way, acts a certain way, talks a certain way, does not mean, and again, even at the end of the day, just because somebody's got a big title or they work at a big brand, does not mean that they know what the hell it is they're doing. It makes it harder for the rest of us. Like, why don't we do that for this Halloween? Why don't we all go as the people we pretend to be on social media? But here again, it feeds this imposter syndrome because you feel like, oh my God, everybody else has it so together. Oh my God, everybody else has all the answers. Everybody else is doing it the right way. Why am I so different? Why do I not have all the answers? Reality is they don't. They maybe fake it a little bit better. They maybe have a little bit more confidence. And ultimately, we'll come back to that because confidence ultimately, I think, is at a big part of this. It's sort of the heart of what it is we're talking about. Now, whenever we talk about imposter syndrome, here again, went out and did a lot of research and really found that it can take on a bunch of different forms. And I think that the form it takes depends on your background, your personality, the circumstances in which you grow up. And with all these shows, I do a lot of research. But in this one, there was one book, one piece of writing that kept coming back to. And it was from a woman named Valerie Young. And I think what I would tell you to do is to go out. If this is something that interests you, go out and get her book. And I think, especially for the men in the audience, you may hear this title and think, why would I get this? Trust me, it's useful to everybody. I'm going to put the link in the show notes. You can go buy it on Amazon. They have it hardcover, softcover, everything else in between. But the book is The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, Why Capable People Suffer from the Imposter Syndrome and How to Thrive in Spite of It. I think it really had the best structure. I think it had the best way of, as I was going through and trying to sort of lay this out, she went through and really laid out what are sort of the 5 different subgroups. And so for this show, I want to make sure, give her credit. And go out and be able to read that book. Because I think that I'm going to use those subgroups to be able to do this. And then bring in and overlay sort of what are my insights. How do we make this specifically for creatives and for what it is that we're going through? But I want to go through each one of these 5 in a little bit more detail so that you can understand what they are. You can really get a sense of what it is. How do you tell if it's you? And then ultimately, if you feel like this is something that is a part of your work or a part of your career, what can you do about it? So the 5 are going to be the perfectionist, the superwoman or superman, the genius, the individualist, and the expert. So we'll start first off with the perfectionist. Now, perfectionism and design imposter syndrome, in my experience, go hand in hand a lot. Because perfectionists are these people that set this like crazy high goal for themselves. And then when they don't reach that insanely unattainable goal, they go through like this major self-doubt and really worry about if they're measuring up. But as it applies to creativity, the other part of this that becomes much more problematic is that they're often also control freaks. And they really feel like if they want something done right, they've got to do it themselves. And this obviously creates a problem because as you advance in your career, as you start taking on leadership, you need to be more and more inclusive with your creative process. You need to be able to trust other people. The worst creative leaders, the worst bosses are the managers who just lay out what the idea is and then let everybody sort of color inside of their lines. That's not what creative people are interested in. That's not what they want to do. And I've talked about this before. It's a test that I'll actually give people who say they want to step up and be in leadership, where I'll give them a problem. And we'll say they'll have 5 days to do it, and I'll give them 2 people to be able to work with. What I want to see, I don't want to see what people say. I don't want to see people on a good day. Because what people say doesn't always match what they do, and everybody's fantastic on a good day. What I want to do is I want to see somebody under stress. I want to see somebody when there's a problem, because I think that gets you a real sense into their psychology. It really lets you understand what they have going on underneath the hood. And so what I'll do is that 5-day deadline, I'll get them started, say they've got 5 days to work on it. The next day I'm going to come back and say something has changed. The deadline has changed. For some reason now, the timeline is greatly accelerated because I want to put them under stress and see how they react, because inevitably you're going to get 2 different results. The first result is going to be that they're going to be the control freak. They're going to be the perfectionist who is going to be afraid. And by doing that, what they're going to do is they're going to pull all the work back into themselves. They're going to say, I have to do it. As opposed to the people who should be leaders, the ones who are not as affected by this particular flavor of imposter syndrome. What they do is they delegate. They come up with a plan. They work with their team and use the resources they have. And the reason why I do this is because it gives you a real clear sense of where somebody is. And again, I think that with all of these, if you are a leader, it's good to understand on your team, which one of these do people fall into? Which one do you fall into? So that you understand, how do you deal with that? Now, if you're asking yourself, okay, great, how do I know if this applies to me? For each one of these sections, there's a couple situations, a few questions that I'm going to ask, and see if you can relate to this. See if this is something that you feel like is you. Like, has anybody ever told you that you're a micromanager? Do you have difficulty delegating? And when you do you get really frustrated, maybe even disappointed in what the results, because they're never as good as what they would have been if you just would have done it yourself. When something doesn't come out the way that you want, right? Like when you miss the mark on something, do you really get down on yourself? Do you kind of like do that, I'm not cut out for this, or you kind of beat yourself up, maybe for hours, maybe for days about, why did it not go really well? But I think ultimately, do you feel like your work has to be 100% perfect 100% of the time? Those tend to be. So if you answered yes to a few of those, you may be in the midst of some of this, because I think that's the thing, right? Is for perfectionists, success is rarely satisfying because you always feel like you could have done better. And the problem is it's not a productive or really a healthy mindset to be in this eternal state of dissatisfaction. Now, this is one of the states, and again, I think as I've gone through my career, there's probably a few of these that I've moved through. I think the first 2, absolutely. In some ways, I think this one, the perfectionist one, I've been able to put behind me a little bit. But the thing that you need to do, and I had one boss who, whenever we were going through and doing a bunch of work, told me this one thing that's really kind of stuck with me. And it's whenever you're in the midst of doing something, to stop, to take it in, to appreciate it. That whenever you do something, own it, celebrate it, because that's how you avoid burnout. It's how you find contentment, and it's how you start to cultivate self-confidence. Because that's sort of the kryptonite to all of this, is to start to figure out, how do you start to build confidence? Now, if you feel like this is you, if you are this sort of perfectionist, you can fight it by doing a few different things. I think the one is just making peace with the fact that you need to take mistakes in stride because it's going to be a part of the process. Having problems is not a problem. This is not math. 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Like 2 plus 2 for us equals like burnt sienna, right? Like channel your best inner Bob Ross and just understand that, again, it's just like a happy little accident. But I think that the other thing to do is to, in a lot of cases, push yourself to start that project, to act before you're ready. Don't sit around and like plan for months at a time. Don't sit around and just like get so far bound up in your head and everything has to be perfect and precious and you hold on to it and you want everybody else to see it and you need to get it until everything's been thought out and it's all completely perfect. And then it's an impossible standard because whenever you show it to people, one, you're going to put so much time and effort into it that if anybody questions anything, you're going to lose your mind. But just the pressure that comes from having to do that by yourself and to take on that amount of stress is just bananas. So again, push yourself to try to open up a little bit faster. Think about it a little bit sooner and do some of those things that, again, can try to help fight some of that perfectionism. Now, as we move on to the next one, the Superwoman or Superman. This is about people who experience this phenomenon because they ultimately, if they're being really honest, if they're letting that inner voice really come to the front, they're somehow convinced that, you know what, they're phonies who are working alongside people who really know what they're doing and that they push themselves to work harder and harder to measure up. This is where I live, right? Because I think at the end of the day, I feel like, man, there are so many other people out there who are so much more talented. And especially as I've done this podcast and whatever this bizarre, so D-list notoriety that's come with it, you feel like you need to live up to being kind of what do people think that you are. And I think for me, throughout my whole career, I've always been the one who's like going to lean in and work harder. And the thing that I've come to accept about myself and especially about this, man, it's just a false cover-up for a big insecurity. Because that work overload, it can be harmful to your mental health, but I think it also can really hurt kind of relationships with other people. Because in some ways, you will start to begrudge or hold over other people or do things if they aren't doing what you do. But again, you're doing this to drive and try to feed this sort of like insecurity. So it creates this really just not very healthy kind of balance around things. Now, again, if you're one asking yourself, like, does this apply to you? Do you do some of these things? Like, do you stay later at the office than the rest of your team, even past the point when you've completed your work, right? Like, because you want to be the first one in and the last one out. You want to, because that says something about you. And this is one of those spots where, again, you know, you can look at this and say, look, Steve, the line between work ethic and this, what's the difference? And again, I think it's about amount, proportion, and the impact it has on you. Absolutely. Don't be the last person in and the first person out, right? Like, don't do that because you're kind of like, I have imposter syndrome. I need to leave. No, that's bullshit. That's not what I'm saying. But what it is it's the amount. It's about how do you find a healthy balance in this? Like, do you get stressed out when you're not working? And like, do you just find like relaxing or downtime to be, you almost feel like it's a waste of time? Again, this is one of those things where there have been points in my life where I have to like force myself to relax, which sounds so stupid. But even then, I'm kind of like, okay, well, I need to play a game or I need to be on my iPad. Like, I need to accomplish something. Like, just sitting still is something that I've had to work on because I ended up going on this vacation. And normally my wife and I go to like destinations and we're running around and we're doing things. This time we went to a beach resort. And she was like, great, we can just lay on the beach. It was like nails on a chalkboard to me because I'm just laying there on there. I'm like, okay, I need to relax. I'm relaxing. I'm not thinking about anything. Am I not thinking about anything? I think I'm not thinking about anything. I'm relaxing, right? Like, this is relaxing. Hey, what about this thing at work? Oh, there's an idea. Hey, what about that? And then all of a sudden I'm spun back up and I'm working again in my head. And it was just insane. And it was not healthy. And I think the other thing I saw was like, I was letting things like my hobbies and my passions fall by the wayside and I was sacrificing them for work. And that's the thing is like, at the end of it is you almost feel like you really haven't earned your title in spite of whatever achievements you have. So you feel the pressure to work harder and longer than everybody else around you so you can prove your worth, right? And I think that what this really comes out of is that if you look at that sort of like persona of a workaholic, it's that they're addicted to the validation that comes from working, not really from the work itself. They like to get things done faster than everybody else. They like to stay later than everybody else. They like that recognition. And again, the destructive part of this is that when that's out of balance is that what you're ultimately doing is that nobody should have the power to make you feel good about yourself, but you. And now as everything is becoming about external validation, external happiness, external things like that, it's not sustainable. It's not going to be a good path for you to go down. So if you want to fight this, what you need to start doing is you need to start training yourself to not just simply get validation from external sources. You've got to recalibrate about how to get this internal validation. So you're able to ease off the gas. You're not going to be that like super person as much. And then whenever you do that, you can gauge how much of the work you're doing is really needed and how much of it is healthy. Because at the end of the day, you control your happiness. You control your joy. And look, that's going to be the hard part about this, is that if you want people to like you, and again, this is almost that overcompensation, but again, as you look at so many of these things, they belie almost the opposite of what the person is trying to project. So in this case, how do you find that validation from yourself? How do you find peace with yourself so that, again, you can have the confidence to push through this sort of stuff? Now we move on to the genius. This is always, it's a little bit of a strange title because I don't know, anybody's like, oh, a genius. I mean, look, some people I know they are and they've got the math scores to prove that or whatever. But it really is, so don't get too hung up on the title. What it really is that this is about people who struggle about how do you judge success based on their ability rather than their effort. And so like the Superman and Superwoman, they just innately feel like they aren't that talented, so they need to overcompensate with work. The genius, they have to, like, look, they're going to work hard, but they assume that you're going to set, again, this impossibly high bar. But unlike a perfectionist, they're going to judge themselves not only on that ridiculous expectation, but on if they can get it right the first time. Because they do think that they're smart enough. They do think that they have the ability. So they have a confidence in that. So again, this is not coming out of that insecurity. This is almost the opposite. This is coming from almost being too secure, too arrogant about what this is. If you're not sure if this applies to you, if you're saying to yourself, hey, is this going to be me? Here are a few questions that you might actually want to ask yourself. Start off with, do you have that track record, right? Are you the kid that got straight A's in schools, gold stars and everything? You always got the trophy, top of your class, and do things like that. And did you do it in everything you do? Were you often told when you were a kid that, you know what, you were in the smart group, you were gifted, you were better, you were special? And did you get that from your friends, your family, your peer group? I think obviously there is a style of parenting that has emerged in the last decade that very much supports this. This is where, again, sometimes the participation trophy, the fact that you are great at everything, can certainly give rise to this. Do you honestly hate the idea of having a mentor because you think to yourself, you know what, I can handle all this stuff on my own? Whenever you're faced with a problem, whenever you're kind of actually need to work on something, whenever you get uncomfortable, do you find your confidence just plummets? And ultimately, does that lead you to avoid challenges because it's so uncomfortable to try something different and that you're not great at that honestly you would probably just rather skip it? Now, those are all definite signs of kind of having that genius problem. Now, if you want to fight it, a few things that you need to do and a few things you need to think about. One is that instead of putting that insane pressure on yourself, you have to get it perfect out of the gate every single time because that is an impossible standard. What you need to do is you need to see yourself as a work in progress because, again, everybody is. Because who you are as a person now, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is down the road is going to change. The people you work with, the teams that you're a part of, the company, all these different factors are going to constantly be in flux. So what you need to understand is that this idea that you're constantly going to know everything, you're constantly going to be right, you're constantly going to be the A student, especially as you get older, is going to get much harder because the other thing that you're going to find is that as you go on in your career, natural talent, the things that you were so good at as a kid, are going to start to become less and less powerful, less and less useful. Because as you go on, those talents are great. They're going to get you to a certain level, but then you're going to start to get to the place where to advance, to get better, you're going to need to start to work on the smaller things, the uncomfortable things, the things that are on the edges of your talent, the things that make you uncomfortable. And that's whenever this kicks in. That's whenever it becomes such a problem. But that's also why it's so important for you to see yourself as a work in progress. And that's it, right? Because like accomplishing great things involves this lifelong learning and skill building, even for the most confident people. You have to constantly be investing. You have to constantly understand there's more to know, especially if you're in creative fields. Good Lord. Like if you look at, 10 years ago, iPhone didn't exist. however many years before that, computers, like things change, new tools come in, new things come in. That has an impact on the way that we work. It has an impact on our customers. Like all these different variables keep moving around. So rather than beating yourself up when you don't reach that impossibly high standard, identify specific, changeable behaviors that you can improve over time. Think about yourself like a product, right? Like if you were an app, how would you say, okay, look, here is the minimum viable person that I want to be. Here are the things that I want to work on. Map those out. Figure out how do you start to work on them. Make peace with the fact that you're a work in progress. And that then you can then start to set about working on those over time. Also, don't feel like, okay, I said I was going to do this and I'm not different a week later. It's not the way this stuff goes. Because for all of these, it's like any change in life. You want to change your diet. You want to change your exercise. You want to change your mind. It is about how do you put small, sustainable changes in place that you can work on over time. Crash diets, the same way it goes with food, doesn't work for your brain. Then all of a sudden, if you're like, hey, big change, big change, big change, then eventually what you're going to see is that it's not sustainable. Your brain doesn't ultimately buy into it. It starts to contract. You go back to the way you were, and then you feel like you were a failure. So again, go about this differently. Now, the individualist is somebody who feels like asking for help really reveals that they're an imposter. Like, it's okay to be independent, but not to the extent where you honestly refuse help from other people just so that you can prove how valuable you are. Especially, creativity is a team sport. It is best whenever done with other people. And so again, you can't be the person that's on the team and just hogs the ball all the time, who just runs around, who takes all the shots, who does all that stuff. One, nobody wants to play with that person, but also for the fact that, again, that's not the way a team functions. So again, if you're wondering, is this me? Some of these questions, right? Like, do you really believe that you need to accomplish things just on your own? Have you caught yourself saying things like, you know what, I don't need anybody's help? Like, does that sound like something that you would say? And I think also, whenever you do ask for help, do you frame that ask in terms of the requirements or the needs of the project rather than your own personal needs? So instead of saying, I need, you would possibly say, like, I need because I need to be able to do this on a project. I need this because there is this deliverable. I need this because the client wants it. Because it's just simply you as a throughput. Because you don't want to take ownership of the question, because then you feel like somehow it makes you look weaker. Now, if you're doing those sort of things, I think that some of the things you can do to help fight it. The first one is, how do you externalize your creative process and share your work in progress? Don't be precious about it. Don't be, and again, this starts to border a line a little bit on the perfectionist, but it's a similar thing here about how do you start to externalize? How do you share out? Because look, sharing things you're struggling with to trusted groups and trusted people makes you feel better. And look, here again, start small. So you can feel comfortable, you can share little things and then build up over time. Again, don't go on like the brain crash diet and be like, here's my biggest, darkest secret, the thing that I struggle with. One, because it tends to freak people out, because if you go from 0 to 200, they're not sure how to deal with it. But again, I think that way you can sort of get comfortable being uncomfortable and start to fight that individualism, because as you go on, here again, if you want to lead a team, if you want to grow in your career, being that individualist will often limit you to being an individual contributor, which again limits a lot of things in your career, that those are only of so much value monetarily, positionally, from a resource perspective to teams. So again, you want to be the person who can work with other people who make them better for you being there, not just they make you better. And again, it's that one-way street. And finally, we have the expert. And the expert is somebody, they feel like they somehow tricked their employer into hiring them. And that as a result, they have this like fear of being exposed as being like inexperienced, or they don't know enough, or they're not knowledgeable. And here's the thing, is that again, as we talk about balance, there's always more to learn. It helps you professionally, keeps you competitive in the job market, keeps you moving forward. I've even talked about how that's why I like to speak. It's why I like to do this podcast. I like to give away what I've learned, even whenever I learn new things. Like about this. This was a subject I sort of knew about. I'd mapped out, went and did a bunch of research, sort of leveled up on it, feel like I'm a little bit better on it, but I like to give it away because it forces me forward. I can't just sit on and kind of saying like, yay, I know this and that's going to make me like feel good. I'm just going to sit on that for a while. But here again, it's about balance. And whenever the balance gets out of whack, it's about this tendency to endlessly seek out more information, to constantly, to almost like hoard it, right? Because it can be a form of procrastination, and it can be a form of insecurity. And, do you, again, are these some of the things that you do? Do you shy away from applying to jobs unless you meet every single requirement because you feel like unless you meet every single one of those, again, somehow you're an imposter? Are you constantly seeking out new classes and training because you think you need to improve your skills? You constantly need to level up, right? And I think that can be a good thing. But on the other hand, if all you're doing it is to do it to keep your insecurity at bay, and it's not something that is useful, it is not something that, again, is really benefiting you, that's something you need to think about. And even if you've been in your role for a while, and by a while, I would say 6 or 8 months at a minimum, and you feel like you still don't know enough, then that can obviously be a problem. And here again, look, there's all stuff in our jobs where, like, there are certain times somebody says an acronym and I'm like, hey, I don't know what that is. That's not what I'm talking about. I feel like if you fundamentally feel like there is this insecurity that you're going to be found out, that's what enough means for that. So if you want to fight it, what I would tell you to do, whenever I've worked with people who've had this in the past, it's about how do you practice, we'll call it like just-in-time learning. How do you go get that knowledge? How do you get that skill when you need it? Rather than hoarding it to really give you this false sense of comfort. Because what you need to do is you really need to realize there's no shame in asking for help when you need it. And if you can't figure out how to solve a problem, then go get advice. Go find a supportive team member. Go find a leader. Go find somebody else. But it's this hoarding where it's not knowledge for a reason. It's just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And that again, is feeding an insecurity. It's feeding a sense of procrastination, as opposed to really facing and focusing on what are those things that really matter. Now, what can we do about all this, right? Like, again, there's some little sort of nuggets in there, but, the reality is that you may fall into one of these categories. You may fall into more than one. I think, you might have a primary and border on a few others, but, you're going to move through these as you go through your career, but the best way to fight this is confidence. And confidence comes from not accepting your failure or disappointment, but partially from knowing that some things are out of your control. Being human, out of your control. Your upbringing, out of your control. Some of those things. But what it also comes from is it comes from knowing your process, questioning your decisions, trusting ultimately yourself. And that trust really comes out of self-awareness. Self-awareness in how do you accept yourself? How do you make peace with yourself? How do you say that, look, where you came from, the way you grew up, the way that you are, it's not wrong. It's just different and it's unique. And everybody's story is different and unique. But because it is different and unique, and that, again, movies and TVs and all this stuff that we watch, this stuff that create these social norms that we don't see ourselves, maybe we don't look like that, we don't act like that, we don't talk like that somehow we are the other. The other is not a weakness. The other is actually your strength. That whenever you lean into it and you accept it, that is the start of confidence. Now, it sounds so easy, like, hey, be more self-aware. Just watch what you do. Hey, have more confidence. But I think as I look at myself, there are 3 sort of areas that I tend to focus on. 3 cheat sheets that I try to keep in the back of my brain to help fight some of this stuff and to help me keep moving forward. The first one is to keep asking for feedback. It is amazing how at first it will not feel like this, but how empowering it is when you open up and admit things that you are afraid of, and the empathy and advice that you get from other people when you do it. At first, you're going to feel like you're going to die, they're going to judge me, and it can be a problem. And the problem is that it is also thinking about the format in which you do this. I would encourage you to do it with people that you know. Do it face-to-face. Do it in those sort of forums where it can be supportive, where you can actually have a discussion. If you go into social media and ask for that, yes, in some cases you will find insane amounts of support and empathy from people you don't know, people who want to come in and rush in and be supportive. But the other part that can be destructive, especially in the early phases of this, and even at other parts, is you're going to find the assholes, you're going to find the trolls, you're going to find the people who just seem to celebrate in just pointing out what they don't like, in making themselves feel better, feel bigger, feel stronger by putting other people down. Now here again, that's a reflection of their insecurity. That's a reflection of their problem, but it's not going to feel like that to you. What it's going to feel like, it's going to feel like rejection. It's going to feel like it fucking hurts. And so what you want to do is to understand and to think about the place and the way, the medium that you use to be able to get that feedback. Because the sooner you're able to identify those fears and give them a voice, the sooner you're going to be able to help and get the help of other people to get you through those challenges. Because that's a big part of so much of this, of so much that we talk about on this show, right? Is how much of the stuff we go through alone. And we don't need to. But it's the fear. It's the insecurity. It's I'm going to be judged. People are going to know something about me. Oh my God, like what's I going to do? They're going to think less of me. No, ultimately they're going to think they're human. And at the end of the day, they're going to think that you're going through probably something very similar to what they're going through. They also just didn't necessarily have the fear to be able to and they were afraid to put that out there. So keep asking for feedback. And then the next one is get out of your area of expertise and get out of your comfort zone. I have talked ad nauseum about how comfort is the enemy of greatness. And that's the thing, is because comfort keeps us limited. We need to learn new things. We need to push ourselves, because that's where confidence comes from, is whenever I say, hey, I'm going to go do something that I don't know how to do. And then when you do it, build some confidence. You think, hey, I put myself in an uncomfortable situation. Hey, I did something new and it was okay. I got through it. I was good at it. You do that enough times, you make peace with yourself. You start to understand your process. You start to say, hey, look, I can get in these situations and be good at it. It doesn't mean that I have to have all the answers. But what it means is that I've got a process. What it means is that I know myself. What it means is that I can do these things and figure it out. And that I have the confidence in that. Not in that I have to have all the answers, but that, again, I can push through and I can figure it out. So get out of your damn comfort zone. And lastly, and maybe the biggest one, is measure yourself by your own standards, by your own palette. As we talked about being that MVP, right? Like, what is the minimum viable person? Like, what are those things that if you had to step back and say, if you had to give advice to yourself, if you didn't know yourself, what were the things that you would say you should work on? What are those kind of things, right? Because it's so easy to be consumed by other people's talents, by comparing yourself to others, and it is an impossible game to win. Somebody is always smarter. Somebody is always more creative. Somebody always has a better background, a bit different resume. Like, they're doing something. You're like, damn it, that's so cool. So just, again, accept that that's going to be there. And that that constant comparison is not going to be useful. It's not going to be helpful. Instead, try to compete with yourself. Where were you? And I want you to think about this. Where were you a year ago? Where were you 6 months ago? Can you measure that improvement over time? Not only from where you've been, because I do think it is good from time to time to stop and look back and to take credit for where you've been, but to also think about and to be deliberate about where are you going. This is why I either want people to build their brand or to think about this, so that, again, your career, your growth, your happiness is not by happenstance. It is not just simply by the opportunities that the company you're a part of gives you. It's about, what do you create? What do you need? How do you understand that? And how do you set that bar and that balance so that you're working on those things that are going to be the things that make you more productive, make you happier, make you stronger, but that, again, are going to be the things that you're measuring yourself against? Because, again, that is a sustainable way of looking at things, because confidence will come and go. But know that we all struggle with this stuff. You're not alone. That having this problem isn't a problem. It's only a problem if you don't acknowledge it and if you don't work on it. If you just simply say, I am the way I am, this is who I am, I'm not going to change, then it's a problem. Because those people will then tend to get more and more frustrated. They tend to get angry and angry as they go through their career about why they're not being recognized, why are they not moving up the ladder, why are they not getting those opportunities. But they, again, remain so rigid, so unchangeable. And you can't get both. You don't get to say, this is absolutely 100% I am. I cannot learn, I cannot grow, and I cannot or will not improve. But then again, why am I not being recognized as being somebody who ultimately improves? Believe that you can be and are a great designer. Do the work. Don't give up. Question your motives. Think about yourself. Understand, and again, make peace with who you are and what you do. Build that self-awareness. Because ultimately what you want to have is you want to have imposter syndrome be less and less a part of your life. That you have the tools to fight it whenever it is, because it is still going to be there. Again, no magic bullet here. You're not going to go, oh, I understand this. Poof, it's gone. It's not going to be gone. It may come in different forms. But again, if you have the self-awareness to say, hey, why is that happening? You have the support of people who can help you along the way with that. You can have the roadmap to continue to work on it. You're that constant work in progress. then again, that is what breeds confidence. And confidence is what can hold this at bay. And that making peace with yourself and understanding that it's okay to be going through this stuff. We all have problems. We all go through this stuff. It is a part of every single person's job. And so again, understand that it's not different. This is just a part of the deal. So as always, if you find this at all helpful, please take a second on your favorite podcast platform, leave a review. Let people know what you think about the show. While you're there, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you get the latest episodes whenever those come out. As always, you can find out more about the shows, get related articles, get the show notes, listen to other shows, do all of that fun stuff. Head over to thecrazy and the1.com, thecrazy1.com. If you want to, follow me on any social media channels. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, all that good stuff. You can go over to Facebook, and whenever you're there, go and type in the Crazy One Podcast, like the show. I'm always posting different articles, answering questions, and doing stuff like that. As always, everybody down in legal wants me to remind you that my views here are my own. They don't represent any of my current or former employers. This is just me out here talking. And finally, I say it every time because I mean it every time, but thank you for your time. I know that time is truly the only real luxury that any of us have. I'm always incredibly humbled that you want to spend any of it with me. So understand, you are good enough. You are smart enough. Damn it, people like you. This imposter thing, again, comes with the deal. And as you're going out there, try to fight it. I'm here for you. Write me if you need help. And all the while you're doing it, stay crazy.